they're able to distract us from the fact that the whole psychology of motivation is fatally flawed, and no reward system can ever produce higher quality, particularly with respect to creative performance. And it doesn't even work, as some psychologists showed a while ago, if you say, well, then let's just reward for better creativity. Now, you can't do it. There's something about the whole process. Creativity is about playing with possibility. It's about playing hunches that might not pay off, whereas a reward leads people to avoid risk-taking whenever possible.
Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision and the culture of healthcare systems. Hello, everyone. This is Patty Fay. Well, I'm starstruck. My guest this week had a big influence on my interest in leadership and organizational culture. Alfie Kohn is the prolific author and expert who wrote the 1993 book, Punished by Rewards: The Trouble with Gold Stars, Incentive Plans, A's, Praise, and Other Bribes. This book clarifies how incentives can squash autonomy and actually undermine the very goals we say that we want. Punished by Rewards generated a boatload of press, including appearances on Oprah, one in which Oprah set up an experiment with teenagers to test Alfie's ideas. There were two groups of teenagers. One group got cash for working on a puzzle. The other group was told to work on the puzzle, but no cash. The group of kids that got the cash reward lost interest in the puzzle. As soon as they got their money, they were done. The unrewarded teens continued working on it after they were told that the session was over. I'll put a link in the show notes to the video. Alfie Kohn has written 14 books and published articles in HBR and opinion pieces in the New York Times. We only had 30 minutes for this conversation, and so read my newsletter for all kinds of related scintillating ideas. Go to the show notes for links and visit alfiekohn.org, where there are hundreds of his superb blogs and other resources. Alfie Kohn, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Nice to be here.
Much of your work has been grounded in the fact that incentives or rewards don't work to achieve engagement with whatever task is being rewarded. And can you talk about that phenomenon and how it's relevant at work?
Sure. Punishments and rewards are two sides of the same coin. They're not opposite strategies. In a punishment, I say to you, do this, or here's what I'm going to do to you to deliberately make you unhappy. And in a reward, I say, do this and you'll get that. In both cases, the goal is compliance. And at best, if the punishment is severe enough, or the reward is juicy and appealing enough, and the likelihood of getting either is high enough, you can sometimes get people to do what you tell them in the moment. However, not only do you not get long-range benefits, but rewards like punishments are not only ineffective, they tend to be counterproductive, particularly with regard to the outcomes that matter most. So, for example, a lot of research shows that when people are doing something, having been promised some reward for it, which could be money, or in the case of kids, it could be toys or food or something like that. When people are doing something in order to be rewarded, the quality of their performance actually declines, particularly on tasks that require creativity or innovative or higher order thinking. And part of the reason for that, which is also a serious problem in its own right, is that rewards tend to undermine people's interest in whatever they had to do to get the reward. So, for example, parents may be interested to hear that studies have found that children who are rewarded or praised commonly by their parents are less generous and caring than kids who aren't. And the effect is most pronounced if they're rewarded or praised for being generous. Because now they've learned that the reason to help someone is not to make that other person feel good. It's to get that recognition or reward themselves. And that's why it's interesting to point out that praise is just a verbal reward and can be just as detrimental as a tangible or symbolic reward. In the workplace, meanwhile, rewards undermine the quality of performance, in part, not exclusively, because they have exactly the same effect on the desire to do the work. So people who used to do something because they found it meaningful and engaging, as soon as they were treated like pets with some kind of incentive plan or pay for performance scheme or bonus, now see the work as just a tedious prerequisite for getting more money or some kind of recognition. The quality of their life declines because of the diminished enthusiasm for the tasks, and the quality of the work declines as well, which is bad for everyone. What matters most, whether we're talking about workplaces or schools or families or other environments, is the importance of working with people, whereas rewards, just like punishments, are ways of doing things to people.
It's almost like it uncouples something that an individual was intrinsically interested in. Now it uncouples that task from their intrinsic interest. And actually, beyond that, I guess it undermines it.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's not just ineffective, it's counterproductive. The word intrinsic is important here. Psychologists distinguish between intrinsic motivation, which means you do it because you find it valuable or worthwhile, fun, interesting, and so on, and extrinsic motivation, which means you do something so that something outside or extrinsic to the task, like getting money for it, is what will result. And what the research, hundreds of studies, found is that extrinsic motivators kill intrinsic motivation. The amazing thing to me is that even managers or educators who know what those words mean and are vaguely familiar with that finding that I just summarized, nevertheless persist in asking questions like, how do you motivate our employees? How do you motivate doctors to give better care? How do you motivate students? And the whole question is misconceived because it doesn't matter how motivated people are. It matters how people are motivated. So there are loads of people who have a high degree of extrinsic motivation, and that's a problem.
Yeah. So from what you said earlier, the more complex and perhaps cerebral the task is, the more harm that's done in a way. Did I hear you correctly on that?
Right. Let me just pause here to say the most destructive form of extrinsic motivation is not just a reward, but an award. An award is a reward that has been made artificially scarce. So if I get it, you can't. In other words, nothing is more destructive to both interest in the task itself and quality than competition. Anytime people are set against each other so that other people have to fail in order for me to succeed, everyone loses, including the organization. Even the winner in this particular contest ultimately will come out of it with less intrinsic interest in the task, and the relationships among all the people have been undermined in a way that it doesn't just make life unpleasant in this workplace, but it also kills quality in the long run. So when all of that happens, the research here with competition in particular finds that competition is most destructive when there's some sort of contest involving a task that requires critical thinking, higher order tasks, and especially if you're interested in quality in the long run. If I offer a prize to a bunch of people who can lick the most envelopes in the next 10 minutes, yeah, if it's a juicy prize, people will lick more envelopes than those who are asked to do that pointless task with no extrinsic motivation involved. But when you start thinking about, providing health care, when you start thinking about understanding ideas deeply, that's when rewards in general and competition in particular do the most damage.
It's like the attention or focus moves from the fascination with and investment in the task at hand, and it moves to scheming or putting my intellectual energy towards how do I get this reward?
Well, it's interesting you say that because some decades ago, that was one of the first hypotheses for why rewards have this surprising counterproductive effect. By the way, that's when you always should wake up when you read a study, you see words like contrary to hypothesis. Even the researchers didn't see this coming. They assumed in the early days that rewards would cause people to have more interest in the task, and they kept finding the reverse. So one of the first hypotheses was there must be a distraction effect, and it turned out that wasn't true. That's not to say there was never a distraction. It means rather that other things that distracted people from the task didn't have the same deleterious effects as rewards in particular. So they had to go back to the drawing board and try to figure out what makes rewards or punishments uniquely damaging with respect to interest in the task going forward. There was more to it than just distraction.
Right. And what is the answer to that? What is the basis for this almost primitive response?
My reading of the research is that there are two things that explain why rewards make people less interested in whatever they had to do to get the reward. One is something I alluded to a moment ago, which is that it reframes the task or activity as a prerequisite. It's a means to an end now, and that inherently devalues it. I mean, if you say to your kid, okay, honey, do all your math problems, including the extra credit problem, you can play a video game for an extra half hour tonight. Well, what if you just taught your kid 2 words, math sucks? The kid figures, this must be something I wouldn't want to do, otherwise they wouldn't be bribing me to do it. And the second reason that I think rewards have this damaging effect, and again, here I'm talking about adults in the workplace as well, is that rewards are controlling. They may be sugar-coated control, and so you don't spot it. But if I threaten people with, you better start improving your metrics here, I want to start seeing better performance, otherwise you better start editing your resume, it's obvious that I'm controlling you with a threat. But if I say to you, if I see an improvement by your next performance assessment, you're going to find extra couple of zeros in your paycheck. It should be obvious, but it isn't always, that that's just as much about someone with more power controlling someone with less power. And we don't like to be controlled. We may like the goodie, we may like the ice cream, we may like the extra money, but we don't like having things that we desire used to manipulate us. And that's what all reward systems are about inherently. It's more obvious or more manipulative in some cases than others. But this helps to explain why a variety of strategies that powerful people use to control less powerful people. And by the way, I've been doing this for decades, and the one thing that has become clearer and clearer to me over the years of looking at this research, writing and talking about it is rewards like punishment are all about power differentials. We resist that, and so we lose interest in whatever is connected with this attempt to control us. This is not an argument against making a living. This is not an argument against giving kids pizza. It's an argument against giving kids pizza to get them to read books. Not an argument against expressing appreciation for people that's heartfelt. It's an argument against using appreciation or attention or acknowledgement or even with children, love as a way of getting them to jump through our hoops.
Wow. So I recently gave a talk and it was called You Can't Innovate in a Threat State. And what I'm taking away from your comments is we really are creating a threat state through this manipulation. I wonder if you could talk more about what happens to creativity and innovation in the face of power impinging on their autonomy.
It has a damaging effect on creativity. That's what I sort of led off with. It's true almost universally across cultures, across genders, across ages, and across situations and tasks. What's so interesting about this research, and as far as I can tell from the management literature, I don't believe I've ever seen a controlled study that has found a long-term enhancement in the quality of work as a result of any kind of reward or incentive system, ever. You can get a short-term boost in the quantity of work, but long-term and quality, I don't think there's ever been a study to show that that's true. And that's astonishing because the average American workplace looks like a giant Skinner box with a parking lot. I mean, that's how, it's just incredibly, it's just endemic. There are loads of consultants whose whole job is to say, oh, well, you were doing the incentive plan wrong. You need to give less money more often, or you need to do bigger checks for fewer people, or to more people, or don't use money, use in kind, or reward groups instead of individuals. And it never works, but it always, by virtue of simply criticizing the details of implementation, they're able to distract us from the fact that the whole psychology of motivation is fatally flawed, and no reward system can ever produce higher quality, particularly with respect to creative performance. And it doesn't even work, as some psychologists showed a while ago, if you say, well, then let's just reward for better creativity. Now, you can't do it. There's something about the whole process. Creativity is about playing with possibility. It's about playing hunches that might not pay off, whereas a reward leads people to avoid risk-taking whenever possible. That's why when kids are given grades in school, they almost immediately depress intellectual risk-taking. And so kids will pick the shortest book,
right,
or the project on a topic they're already familiar with. Not because they're lazy, not because they don't have a growth mindset, because of the structure of rewards leads them to say, duh, the chance of my getting this carrot that you're dangling in front of me is obviously heightened if I'm doing something that's easier. The problem is systemic. It's not with the attitude or orientation of the individuals involved, and that's true with adults in workplaces as well. And of course, they always lead to these perverse incentives, or create these perverse incentives. If you're going to reward hospitals for their success rate with surgeries and other procedures, then they're going to do everything possible to select procedures that are less risky,
Yes.
And so it goes. There are many, many examples in other fields as well where this happens, and people will do what they can to earn the reward, but getting the reward doesn't mean higher quality. It means in various ways and for various reasons, lower quality.
In preparing for this, it occurred to me that when I've written before about what I call the business school mindset, or BSM, the idea that MBA programs, which are criticized a lot by professors from within the business schools themselves, when they do the research, they don't work to produce leaders and managers who can step into organizations and actually lead and manage. But what they do is signal to, the big banking firms and big consulting organizations that these graduates that have emerged from Harvard or Stanford, from the MBA programs, they can withstand the competition. They can take the knocks inherent in getting into those top programs. They've kind of proven their, mojo, and it's really unrelated and unproven that they actually come out as effective managers. And do you have any thoughts about that fact, that what we're really producing are highly competitive individuals who are then coming out and seeking to lead our organizations?
Well, competitiveness is one damaging effect. Competition is a subset here of what we're talking about. Anyone who's competitive needs to succeed at the price of other people's failure. So competitiveness is completely different from excellence. And competitiveness, contrary to the American myth, or religion in this country, is contrary to that myth. Competition actually gets in the way of excellence. But my brief here is not just with competition, but with other features of control and the use of rewards and incentives and so on. But what you identify as a sort of business school mindset, I've watched happen in education, where more and more research about education is conducted by economists who measure everything, reduce everything not only to numbers, but use standardized tests as an indicator of achievement or success, even though those tests measure what matters least, intellectually speaking. And I think the same thing is true when you get hold of healthcare policy. When you've got an economics mindset, the question it becomes, how do we structure the incentives? And their whole career is about tweaking them.
Right.
Having accepted on faith as almost a matter of religious dogma the premise that people respond to extrinsic incentives, that's not open to question. The only question is you're allowed to ask is what kind of incentive? And what the psychological research shows when you get past the crude, orthodox Skinnerian behaviorism on which all neoclassical economics is constructed, is that no incentive can work. It can only do damage. So the question is, how do we get rid of extrinsic incentives? How do we stop treating people like pets?
Yes. How do we?
Well, that depends on the specific domain that we're describing. How do we offer evaluation and feedback in medical school? I have a specific set of answers. You want to talk about how do we help doctors to do their best in their practice? That's a different set of answers. Or other people in different workplaces, students in schools, helping children to become good people. The specifics of the answer of how you work with people will change and be more complicated for the folks trying to help them do that. Whereas the simplistic controlling response of how do we make them do it using some variant of bribes or threats, the first step is to get beyond that. And then the rest depends on the particulars. One through line, though, one common denominator in many different arenas with different kinds of people is you bring in the people who are affected by the policy, and you do more asking than telling. The one thing we know is that people are more likely to be excited about their work when they're consulted about every aspect of it and don't feel controlled. So it's not just about getting rid of the most egregious forms of control, including but not limited to incentive plans and recognition ceremonies and so on. It's then about the next step, which is affirmatively bringing people in a more democratic environment where people are consulted, where we understand their concerns, and we work with them to try to figure out a better policy. Another aspect of hallmark of a working with approach is to feature collaboration. Step one is you get rid of what destroys it, which is any kind of contest or competition or awards. But step two is how do we then affirmatively create a truly collegial, collaborative environment? Obviously, the first step is you never set people against each other so that he has to fail so I can succeed. But then the next step is how do we set up a actively collaborative environment where nobody succeeds alone. We're all in this together. And how do we learn from one another? And
yes.
And I guess my third overall point that applies in all environments would be to look at the tasks. If you're asking people to do what feels to them inherently uninteresting, garbage, a leader may be tempted to manipulate them to do it.
Yes, the more the incentives and manipulation are held up and seen as absolutely required, that might be a clue to look at, are we having physicians spend 2 hours inputting data into the computer instead of using their intellect?
Yeah, exactly. One of my favorite quotations is from an early sort of humanistic management consultant named Frederick Hertzberg.
Yes.
And he once said, idleness, indifference, and irresponsibility are healthy responses to absurd work.
I love that.
But you see who benefits from the assumption that the task is fixed and you can't do anything about that. Therefore, we just have to throw a doggy biscuit at people for doing it better or faster or whatever. But, you do it in stages. I offered some thoughts about some of these issues to a couple of people who then wrote an article that appeared in JAMA last month, which is about patient experiences in healthcare and how you ask them to report on whether they had a positive experience staying in the hospital. You never, ever, ever should ask people to rank the experiences. so that you create this artificial scarcity of good quality health care so that there always have to be losers. So step one is ask people to rate it if you must use numerical measures, which I generally oppose, because typically when you over-quantify things, you distort the reality of what you're doing by forcing some things to be expressed in numerical terms. But if you're going to have them rate them, okay, but don't ever have a ranking system.
Oh, there's so much to be said about that and the corporations that I guess make an assumption that they do a really bad job hiring because they want to get rid of 10% of their workforce annually, that forced ranking. I mean, what are they saying about their own ability to hire and coach if they're going to get rid of 10% of the workforce annually?
Yeah, exactly. I had a friend who was a management consultant who said CEOs and others would say something like, how do I deal with all this dead wood in my company? Mm-hmm. And he would always say, I think what you're really asking is, why am I hiring trees and killing them?
Oh my, I might have to use that one. Well, I have exploited your time here. We're a little bit over, but can I ask you one final question?
Sure.
It is a quote that I read from you, and I would love to have you expound on it. It says, a society in which no one is willing to risk being called a troublemaker is a place where power is certain to be abused.
Well, I hope, like most things I say, that it sort of speaks for itself. In many cases, we find ourselves in systems that are problematic because of the way the system is set up, not just because of the attitudes or backgrounds or lack of talent or effort of the individuals involved. And there are people who benefit from that system, which is why it tends to persist. My favorite question in Latin is cui bono, which means who benefits from this? Who benefits from persuading folks that if we're not going to punish, we must use reward? Who benefits from a system where we constantly are talking just about leadership rather than about more democratic egalitarian organizations where it's not just what do we do with the authority vested in one powerful person? Who benefits from, as I indicated before, reframing the question to what kind of incentives do we set up instead of asking whether we should have incentives at all? And there are some people who benefit. And when there are some who benefit from a structure that does not benefit most folks, then you need gadflies. You need people who are willing to challenge authority and to do that in a way which sometimes is risky for them. That's what I meant by that. I worry when people are just putting their heads down and saying we can't rock the boat, or using one of umpteen other expressions meant to rationalize inaction, like, well, that train has left the station, or we need a seat at the table, or I have a whole list of those. These are ways of just allowing the status quo to be perpetuated so you don't make trouble, and that tends to create and perpetuate unjust systems. That's why we need people to raise their hands and say, I don't think this makes sense. And ideally to organize and mobilize others who also harbor their doubts about the value of the status quo so that they're not doing it on their own.
Yeah. Raise their hands. Yep. Raise their hands and maybe in some cases shake their fist. In some organizations, there is quite a bit of power that is dormant.
That's right.
That I think could be used to put other values forward. I think when you ask who benefits, it's the people in power that benefit. It is, as you did say, that it's the status quo. Clearly, with engagement in the country at never more than 40% engagement, I mean, we're creating harrowing lives for people, and something really has to change.
Agreed.
Well, Alfie Kohn, thank you so much for saying yes. And where would you like to have people reach you?
My website, which is my name, Alfie, A-L-F-I-E, Kohn, Kohn.org, has information about my books as well as hundreds of articles that are freely available on these and related topics.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for your interest.
Thanks for listening to the License to Lead podcast. Be sure to visit licensed2leadpodcast.com to join the conversation, access the show notes, and sign up for our newsletter. Leave us a message with your provocative question or your thoughtful comments. You might inspire a future episode of the License to Lead podcast. Thanks so much, everyone.